Cool. Alrighty. Well, please put your hands together for the long overdue presentation from Mr. Harold Heatwole.
Well, I'm doing something today that I've never done in a lecture before, and that is I've written it out and I'm going to be reading a good bit of it. At 91, I do that so that I spare you the boredom of a short-term memory while I seek the right word or remember the right name or date or something like that. So bear with me for that. I've gone through this and I designed it for an hour's talk, and it came out to an hour and 1 minute. And that was accidental, of course, but it may go a bit more than that. I've made a few changes, so it may go a bit more, maybe 10 or 15 minutes more, so I can ask your indulgence for that. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the help that my wife Sue has put into this. She organized the pictures and so on that you're going to see tonight.
Ooh!
The first stanza in the poem "Rose Not Taken" by Robert Frost reads, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the less troubled one, and that has made all the difference. About 90% of the biology in the tropics is in the tropics, but at the time that I began my career, but only 5% of the biologists were resident there. When I finished my first PhD, I sent myriads of queries about any available jobs in the tropics worldwide, and in which I could begin even in English. And I decided I would simply accept the first positive reply. Let fate decide. I didn't even apply for a number of choice jobs in the United States that were recommended to me by Dougal Brown, the head of the graduate program in zoology at the University of Michigan. He was furious with me for making such an unwise decision and said PhDs from the University of Michigan go to top universities, not to such places. And he predicted I would go tropical and be never heard from again. The University of Puerto Rico replied with an offer almost immediately, and I accepted it. The very next day, I got an offer from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, then an overseas extension of the University of London. I would have preferred that, but it was too late. Maybe I took the wrong path? I don't know. In Puerto Rico, I was immediately saddled with administrative duties, something unusual for someone in their first job. And so I queried the head of the department why I was assigned this task, and his reply was that, well, because I owe people so many favors and they want to influence decisions about their relatives in the graduate program, I can just blame you for anything they don't like, because you're a gringo. Who doesn't understand our payback system? I found it out to be true. Up there I worked with Richard Levins on a survey of reptiles, amphibians, ants, and fruit flies on the small islands surrounding Puerto Rico and the American and British Virgin Islands. Our first mode of operation was to hire a fisherman to take us for a specified island and drop us off, and with a volunteer, a student or two, and a lifeboat cover for a tent. We only paid him, however, when he came back at the designated time to bring us home. On one occasion, in the days before weather forecasting was as accurate as it is now, I took my wife Audrey and two small sons to a tiny island off Tortola called Sandy Spit. I collected specimens for my research while they collected shells and had a holiday. The weather turned bad, the sky turned purple, the wind whipped up, and the sea became tumultuous. It seemed likely that in the pending weather, that tiny key might be swamped. It was only about this high above high tide level. Well, we put each kid, and I would like to point out that one of those kids is Miguel.
Oh, wow.
That's sitting there. Do you remember this, Miguel?
Oh, hell yes. It was wet.
Where was I? Yeah. we put each kid in a separate duffel bag and hung them to the limb of what we chose to be the most likely tree not to be washed over. And we hoped to survive the night. And my son Eric had brought his teddy bear along, and we wished that in the crotch of the tree. Later on in the night, Audrey thought she heard someone call, but I thought it was only the howling of the wind. However, then I saw a flash of light on the beach. It was Dick Levins, who had arrived on Tortola that day in preparation for work on a different island later on. He tried to get someone to use a fisherman, to use their boat to rescue us, but person after person refused to go out in such weather. He finally got someone to make the attempt, and Dick rescued his life to accompany the operation to make sure a genuine attempt was made to rescue us. Dick never revealed what he had to offer that fisherman. He refused to tell us. Later, after we finished, after we had financial support from a grant, we bought a 13-foot fiberglass, unsinkable Boston whaler. You could cut them in two, and saw them in two, and both halves would still float. They were filled with styrofoam between plastic. We even took it from Puerto Rico to Tortola in the British Virgin Islands, 208 kilometers away over the sea. We only stopped in St. Thomas Island on the way to get petrol. We hired Mary Lou Pressick, Levin's first postgraduate student, and Faustino McKenzie as research assistants. And I'm sure you remember Faustino.
No.
You don't? Okay.
Sorry.
Matt was an amazing postgraduate student, and he was an amazing diver and an excellent boatman. Each evening he would take our order for the species and price and size of fish we each wanted for dinner, then don a mask and snorkel and go spearfishing. He seldom failed to fill our orders exactly. On one such occasion, I needed to get back to Puerto Rico to give lectures to my class the following day, but the weather turned bad, and there were small boat warnings. Well, we thought it over, talked it over, and decided that the 13-foot Boston whaler was not really a small vessel. So we made the trip all the way back in the rough weather. There were a lot of many other adventures. But these two examples help provide an example of some of the challenges to the study of insular biogeography in the Caribbean at that time. Later, the university bought a marine research vessel called the Medusa, and we could conduct research on islands in a safer and more comfortable style. During my summer months when in Puerto Rico, I either taught animal behavior at a field station at the University of Virginia or conducted research in the Darien region of Panama. The latter took place in pristine rainforest bordering the Chuquenaki River in the only gap of the Pan-American Highway that otherwise runs from the Arctic Circle in Alaska to the tip of South America. Owen Sexton from Washington University and I, with a colleague or student or a Panamanian hired from a village now river, undertook a survey of the herpetofauna. The only previous expedition to that area at all was in 1934, the year I was born. And there was the Kuna tribe, which is the nearby tribe, staged a rebellion that year. And it was sort of thought that this biologist had some influence on that. And that was never resolved definitely, however. We lived mostly on the river in Bohio with a family of Chocos. After the second season, I went through a ceremony and they made me an honorary Choco. The purpose of our project was to survey the rainforest before the imminent closure of the Darien Gap. It was said that just in a few years they were going to build a highway right through the Darien Gap, and then you could drive all the way from Alaska down to the tip of South America. And so we thought this was a great idea. what we would do is study the fauna, just the herp fauna, just before that. And afterwards, then we'd go back in a few years' time and see what changes had taken place, probably animals following the road construction and going from one side to the other. And but unfortunately, that never happened. That gap has still not been paved, and we're still waiting. But in the meantime, Owen Sexton died, and I'm waiting for somebody else to come along who will take up this job and finish the project sometime in the near future. I won't be able to go on the field trip, but I'm hoping somebody will do that. In the first job in Puerto Rico, I was immediately saddled with administrative tasks. I was placed in charge of the master's degree program and directed the university's field station in the rainforest. The head of the department explained the unusual experiment as, let's figure out. I've already talked about that in another context. After 6 years in Puerto Rico, suddenly a new path opened. We're talking about the paths in the woods. Well, a new path opened up one day, just by chance. John LeGay Burton from the University of New England in Armidale had spent a sabbatical year in Jamaica and was taking a Caribbean holiday in Puerto Rico before returning home to Australia. He came to the university, and I was walking down the hallway near the front door. And he came into the biology building, and had I been 15 seconds earlier, or 15 seconds later, we wouldn't have collided. And he probably would have asked someone else to show him around the biology department. Well, I gave him a tour, and we spent several hours talking afterward. He was interested in my research, and I was fascinated by his comparison of the languages of the Eastern Rosella and the Crimson Rosella in Australia. Well, by the time we quit talking, it was near closing time. What happened again? I couldn't.
It just decided it was dark.
I can probably read it not very well. Yeah, by then it was near the closing time of the working day, so I invited him to come home with me for a cocktail. Afterward, my wife then invited him to stay for dinner. And after he went back to Australia, we stayed in contact frequently by letters and so on. And one day I got an invitation from the University of New England to apply for a position in the Department of Zoology that was left vacant by someone who had retired. The head of department in Puerto Rico, Gustavo Candela, said, "You won't want to go there. There's nothing there but sand and kangaroos." Well, there are those two things. There's a lot more, but after a lengthy discussion, he said he would give me a leave of absence without pay for up to 3 years, and then I could come back to the UPR. In the meantime, I could sublet my apartment into faculty residences. That was very generous, and I agreed. However, even before the end of the first year, we decided to remain permanently in Australia, and I subsequently took out Aussie citizenship. One of the many reasons why we made that decision was that our children were at the demonstration school in Armidale, and it was far superior to public education in the United States at that time. You had to send your children to a very expensive private school to get them educated to the same level that the public school system was operating here. The wisdom of that decision was evident when after 3 years I took a half sabbatical, supposedly 6 months, but then I took it just before the Christmas and long vacation. So I gave me a few extra months. The wisdom of that decision was evident after 3 years, but evident. There was evident some of the following events. There was political unrest on campus at the UPR, and one day there was a battle between the pro-independent student group and the ROTC, that's Reserve Officers Training Corps, that trains students for later service in the U.S. military. Molotov cocktails were thrown, and BB guns fired. I watched this battle on my way home from work and was photographing its progress until the pro-independent students threatened to smash my camera. So, well, afterwards a helicopter flew over and announced on the public address system that anyone left on campus at the end of half an hour would be arrested. Well, I went home. The result of the battle was one female student was shot and killed by the police, and the campus was closed. I couldn't get on campus to feed my animals, and they died. That bit of research is still unfinished. During my time in Puerto Rico, I thought that perhaps someday I would take a sabbatical year in Australia and to conduct some field work on sea snakes. I was also interested in desert herps, and Australia was a good place for that. When I came to Australia, I studied the ecology of herps in the vicinity of Armidale and the islands of the Torres Straits, and in New Zealand, I studied the Tuatara. There also were some memorable research expeditions to the Central Deserts, Cape York Peninsula, Norfolk Island, and Lord Howe Island. Each of these would fill the whole hour. So I really have to collapse everything into very small amounts of time. In the mid-1960s, there were very few herpetologists that died, and almost all of the papers on that topic were taxon, then consisted of descriptions of species from the museum, and practically nothing was known of the biology of these species. I had to be innovative in finding ways to study sea snakes. Getting on tourist trips to the reef was expensive and didn't really allow adequate time to do meaningful work. In desperation one day, I called Commander Osborne, the chief hydrographer of the Australian Navy, and asked if there was anything he could do to help me. I was really surprised at the answer. He said, be in Cairns next week and you can go on as an honorary officer on a sovereignty cruise for the Great Barrier Reef and the Coral Sea aboard the minesweeper HMAS Teal. Now, I'm sure that one wouldn't happen today. And during that cruise, I launched, and a sailor were to take me where I wanted to go, and provide opportunities to dive were provided to me at every stop. There were two dramatic events. One, at Marion Reef, the sailors were fishing, and it provided a feeding frenzy by sharks to an extent that eventually all of the fish they caught on lines were either taken by sharks, and the best they could pull up was one head still left on the line. When the launch was lowered over the side, and in preparation for me to go diving. And I was a bit skeptical about the wisdom in doing that. And but I dutifully got into the launch, and then the AB, the sailor who was to drive me out to where I wanted to dive, was wiggling the wooden rudder into a slot, ready to take off. And it was hit by a shark, and a wooden rudder about that thick, it took a bite right out of it. At that point, I decided it was wise to abort the dive for that day and wait till the following day. Well, all the sailors who'd been fishing started jeering me and yelling coward and things like that. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, I will go, as long as one of you accompanies me. I got no takers. Nobody volunteered. The second incident, when diving another day, I found a lot of cannonballs on the reef that turned out to be from the wreck of HMS, not HMAS, it was a British ship, Porpoise, in 1803. An officer came when we called back to the ship. An officer came in a wind tracks to collect, and he overloaded the small metal dinghy with a lot of cannonballs. It was rough weather. And on the return to the mothership, the wind tracks sank, took all the cannonballs with it. There's still a lot more left in the shallow water of the reef. But the sailor on watch, who was supposed to be watching all the shore stuff and making sure everything was going right, he didn't pay much attention, and they didn't realize that something had happened until we just almost going over the horizon, and they finally came and rescued us there in the water, waiting to be taken home. Well, those are the two main events that would be of some interest, I think. When the Teal returned to Cairns, however, at the end of that voyage, it anchored near a Dutch naval vessel called the De Moor that was conducting a marine biological survey of the Queensland waters. They were seeking Australian scientists aboard to complement their Dutch biologists. So I transferred my kit directly from the Teal to the De Moor and continued my research on the sea snakes. This was the kind of hitchhiking I had to do all the time in the early days when I didn't have any financial grants or anything like that. And one of those, the Cape Moreton, hitchhiked on that. It was a supply ship for the lighthouses of Queensland that in those days were mostly manned. They weren't automatic lighthouses the way they are today. And the families, say, lived there, and the ship moved up and down the reef bringing their supplies. And at each stop where they unloaded supplies to the lighthouse people, I was able to take that time to dive for sea snakes. Well, this early work, sort of done by the seat of your pants, attracted the attention of some of the commercial filming companies, and they invited me to help with their work in exchange for an opportunity for me to have my own research, to do my own research. And these included expedition with Ron and Valerie Taylor and with Dan and Eva Kropp, which in turn led to being featured in a film on the U.S. TV show Wild Kingdom that was conducted by Marlon Perkins. On that expedition of the Wild Kingdom, they interviewed me at the side of the boat when I surfaced from a dive, and later when they were editing the film and so on for production for the TV program, they realized that the slapping of the water against the side of the hull interfered with my voice. So they had the option of either sending somebody over for me to re-record that, or to find somebody else that had the combination of Australian and American accents to fill in for me. Well, they chose the option of having someone else do it. And my mother saw this feature on TV in the United States and wrote to me saying it was so nice to hear my voice. I didn't disillusion her. And my sister, who hadn't seen me for 20 years, said that wasn't Hal's voice. Some of my involvement with commercial enterprises were of less value than others. Kenneth McLeish of the National Geographic magazine in the United States invited me on a sea snake expedition that gave me an opportunity to do some work on sea snakes' lungs. And he told me my main objective, however, was to make sure that the subsequent article was authentic. Now, the Taylors always were very, very scientifically accurate. Ben Kropp sort of bit truth a lot. For example, he had some frozen sharks in the big fish freezer. And there were times when he had women in bikinis swimming around, and then somebody off a picture would shove one of these frozen sharks and go whizzing towards them, and they would back off and things like that. That was very sensational, but it was far from the truth. And now I didn't get an opportunity to see the final draft of the article before they published it in National Geographic. And I was embarrassed by it. And some of the things that they portrayed were not really accurate. They had one of a sea snake approaching a diver, just the hands up and was showing fright. And it was merely one that was, they often do, they'll come up, they see something in the water, they'll come up and they'll stick their tongues out and see what it is. And unless you smell like a fish, well, you're okay. And then they would just go away. Well, that's what was happening. And he portrayed it as attack of snakes. Okay, where was I? Up here somewhere. I did sustain a bite, however, and I was bitten while I was doing a mark recapture study, so I had freeze-branded numbers on the side of the snake, and we could get it at different times and measure its growth and all sorts of things about it, and I learned a good bit about its biology. And so when I recaptured number 108, we had the tail marked with tags that we clipped through. They were fish tags that were used by the fishery people. We clipped it through the snake's tail, and with the number on. And then when we found that snake again, we recognized it as an individual we caught before. We could see how much it had grown and this sort of thing. And what the procedure was is we'd find a snake, and I would catch it in snake tongs. I would grab it by the back of the head, and then I would hold it out the tail to Peter, and he would climb it through. And then I would turn around away from Peter and shove it as far as I could away from us. Normally these snakes would just flee, but one of them didn't come to me. It came all the way around me and went straight for Peter. It apparently knew who'd hurt it. It was clamped its tail, so I don't know. Anyway, Peter took off at great speed, and the snake in hot pursuit now. I've got to find where it was on this. Danny somewhere. Yeah, no, okay. You have this. Yeah, you have the picture of Peter. Yeah, that's Peter trying to get away from it, and the snake in pursuit. I couldn't. I'm not all that great a swimmer. Without my flippers, I'm pretty helpless. I need my flippers to make any progress. Anyway, I knew I wasn't keeping up with him, so I took a picture. No, I gotta get something out of it.
Somebody has to do that. Yeah.
Lost the place again.
Couldn't keep up the.
Oh yeah, the following trip after that, we went out and I should mention that Peter said that he wasn't going to help me anymore at that trip. That in fact that he was going to climb up to the mast and stay up there until we got back to Glasson, if I would rather than come and help me anymore. Well, the next field trip, I didn't recover. We marked 93, I think it was 90-some fish, snakes, and the next year when we went out to catch them, we didn't get a single recapture, but there were a lot of tailless snakes, and apparently with these metal tags that glint and look like a small fish. That's my theory. I didn't have any way of testing it. But I think that's what happened, and the predator would snap their tail on it. So,
Wow.
Well, I did get bitten once. Where am I? I'm not showing up later.
Yeah.
The only we tried a different method then of marking the snakes. We would get a fish, a recently killed fish, and we would put a sonic transmitter, each one with a different frequency, and we would shove it down the snake's throat. And then we'd go scuba diving and find a foraging sea snake, and we would stick it in front of it, and it would swallow it. And it would digest the fish, but the transmitter wouldn't pass into the intestine, and so it stayed in the stomach. And then we could dive with an underwater directional link. The way we'd do it, just under the surface, we would do a 360-degree sweep around it, and then where the sound would get louder and louder, so we knew that was the direction. Then we would do a vertical sweep, and that would give us the angle, go down, and there we would find the snake. Well, the only sea snake, and I'm going to emphasize sea snakes a bit more than other things today, but I had to pick one to be in a little bit more detail. Otherwise, it would be a hodgepodge. The only sea snake that is distributed all the way across the Pacific to the waters of the Americas is Hydrophis platurus. It used to have a different name, but that's its more recent name. However, there were unsubstantiated reports of my favorite taxons of marine sea snakes of the genus Latticauda, and that were also claimed to have reached the Central American coast, all the way across the Pacific, just like Hydrophis. But that was the only species that had been documented definitely to have gone across the platurus. But all these reports from fishermen that there was this sea snake that when described, it sounded like my favorite taxon of sea snakes, which is Latticauda, that genus. So Natalie Klotz and Mary Lou Pressick and I went there to try to get some specimens to verify this rumor that the species had crossed the Pacific. Well, we hired a boat and a very enthusiastic crew to help us get some voucher specimens. Despite the less than optimal hookah system for diving, to say the least, instead of a scuba diving, they had a hookah. So it's a long tube that is fed by a compressor from the surface. It goes right into your mask. And you can't go any further than the length, of course, of the hose. Well, that was sort of an antiquated way of diving, but that's what they had available for us. And so we used that. And mentioned here by, these are the crew, that's Mary Lou Pressick and Natalie that went with me. And that's our crew of a very enthusiastic boatmen who were interested in helping us do this. They thought that was fun. Well, there's the antiquated hook system with a very rusty compressor. The very bad conditions for diving, but we did anyway. Anyway, we caught some of the snakes, and they were all eels. And so we at least we solved the mystery. The haphazard study of sea snakes was replaced in these hitchhiking ways and all sorts of things. Was replaced by expeditions aboard the Alpha Helix. And that's a ship with a floating research laboratory operated by Scripps Institute of Oceanography in California. And William Dunstan organized these. The U.S. Navy transferred whatever equipment was needed from various sources in the USA, or music and scripts, to the ship for our use. And they confidently indicated that they could match whatever equipment you have in your home laboratory. Well, in my case, it gave me access to equipment I only dreamed about before. And And we were able to record the heart rates of snakes that were diving in the sea. I went down on scuba, following them, with a line to the surface, and a float with a light on it. And I could click in a sort of modified Morse code what the snake was doing. And there was somebody standing on the fantail that was reading my messages, and then with a walkie-talkie telling the person in the lab down under deck who was watching the electrocardiogram. And he would write on the electrocardiogram, resting or foraging or whatever it was doing. And so we got some rather unique information that the technology to get their heart rate at depth. The U.S. Navy, we had them transfer us what it's called. And this is why I'm reading most of it. I can't remember what it was actually called.
Bathythermograph.
Bathythermograph. Now, these are leads that record temperature very rapidly. And they put it on a big lid weight and drop it over and it goes plummeting down, and as it goes down it records the temperature change. And that's how the Navy gets those sorts of data. Well, I use that to, there are double leads in it. I use that as an electrocardiograph. And so we could get the heart rates of these snakes as they were underwater, which it worked. And our electrocardiograph leads were 366 meters long. So we were measuring the sea snake's heart rates 366 meters away from the ship. Not that deep. Well, helix to Australasia and the Philippines were perhaps the greatest boost to the study of sea snakes ever to happen, up at least to that time. On one of them, he had all 12 herpetologists in the world who at that time were consistently studying sea snakes. Now, that's almost nobody, but that was all of us. And now there would be untold numbers. I wouldn't even guess how many. All of the results of his expeditions were included in a book called The Biology of Sea Snakes, and that embodied the results of those expeditions, but it also gave me an outline for summarizing much of my previous work as well. So that allowed me to really put it all in one place. And I wrote currently, or co-authored with colleagues, 6 of the 23 chapters in the book. So that's where I got to download all my work up to that time. And some of it was later supplemented by some similar work on a New Zealand ship, the Acheron. Well, with this background under my belt, I feel confident in applying for grants to independently fund my own research on sea snakes. The second great impetus after Dunstan's expeditions were those instigated by Nobuo Tamiya from the University of Sendai in Japan, Andre Manis, also a venomologist, from the French Nuclear Center near Paris, and Hal Cogger, as you all know, from the Australian Museum, and myself. And we collaborated on various expeditions funded by the Japanese government. And a lot of work was done on that. That's Andre Manis that you see there, and Hal Cogger. We spent a lot of time also, not only on expeditions on the Japanese vessels, but any one of those would warrant an hour's call, for various reasons. And Nobuo organized expeditions over a wide range of the Pacific islands to study the sea snakes. In each case, on each trip, we were accompanied by some of our students or other upcoming scientists, and they learned a lot from their participation on that. The last one of those expeditions was very sad indeed. Nabuo was too ill to participate personally, and his son, also a biologist, went in his place. That Nabuo had advanced cancer. At the end of that voyage, we gathered at Nabuo's home in Sendai for an evening together. It was a very emotional time for all of us. We're close friends, and we knew it was our last meeting with Nabuo because of his ill health. We charged the younger participants to continue the international cooperation that had been so productive. Unfortunately, both Nabuo and Andre Manis died from cancer, and the collaboration of the next generation did not materialize. But a lot of information on sea snakes was gathered on those. And well, that brings to mind another one, which I didn't have listed here, and it may prolong the talk a little bit. But on another island, there was a species of Laticauda that was endemic only to that island. And so had almost no information on it until we were there with our expedition. Well, the genus Laticauda is highly venomous. It gives a bite of the full complement of venom that it has at its disposal, and could deliver in one bite if it so chose. It could kill 53 people. So they're highly venomous. And yet in New Guinea and other places where that species occurs, children, I should say that the Laticauda is a genus. All the species of that genus come out on land. They only forage in the sea. They have paddle-shaped tails and everything like the sea snake. But they only forage in the sea for food, or mainly that. And Rick has studied them a lot. He's one of the world's authorities on this genus. And but this was on the island. Niue. On the island. This is why I've written it out. On the island of Niue. We were studying that, and Andre wanted some pictures taken of it in natural habitat. So we went. We took one in a mesh bag out, and we'd get to a very nice, beautiful coral bobby or something. We'd open it up and turn it loose, and he could photograph it. And then I'd go and scoop it up again. We'd go to the next one and do it again, and he was getting a lot of good photographs. Well, he knew that these were scarcely ever known to bite anybody. And on that expedition, we'd had various people doing different projects, and they were having him daily, and none ever tried to bite. So he got sick of this in and out of the bag, so he just grabbed it in his hand, and he's swimming to the next bommy, and he went and bit him on the hand. Well, that aborted the dive. I think we released the snake and let it go. I don't remember exactly. And when we got back to the shore, we immediately did the wrapping, the bandage that not a tourniquet, a pressure bandage. You know, they don't recommend the tourniquets anymore. And so that will prevent the distribution of the Elizabeth Cameron, who's also here. Yeah. And we were on Saibai Island on one of these trips, and the director, I think it's called, what is it? The director Liz, the head man called? The
Chairman.
Huh?
Chairman.
Chairman, yeah, the chairman of the island, he sort of ran the island. They put us in first into the school, and gave us that was our headquarters for accommodation, our laboratory work or whatever. And the school children were delighted because they got a holiday. You could dismiss them from school. But one day he got a message saying that the Queensland government was sending up an inspector of schools. So he conducted an inspection. Well, they moved us out of school and put us into the hospital instead. And there you see Liz in the center with Annette, and then Jillian Curtis and myself and various of the local residents. The local residents really quite appreciated this because the chairman of the island would only let the pub be opened when he said so, and he didn't drink alcohol, and so it was never opened except when they had guests. And since we were guests of the island, whenever we wanted a drink, he would open the pub, and we became very popular with the local population. Now that was where am I now?
There we go.
Yeah. Another major collaborator was Harvey Lillywhite from the University of Florida. And we rented a house in Weepa and were allowed to convert a large room in a nearby motel into our laboratory for the study of local herpetofauna, and including marine snakes. And there's a picture of us doing so, catching sea snakes at night. I also studied land snakes, but will mention only one of such projects. When the spinning cobra is molested, it injects venom at the eyes of its assailant. And my study was to test their accuracy at various distances. I housed these snakes in a room with the floor tiles of 1 square foot, and I put a plastic mask on my face, and with an outline of my eyes. And then I would approach the snakes to see what the critical distance was. And it was very constant. It didn't change very much. But I was getting some data from the shoot earlier. So I had some data there. But I couldn't get beyond that critical point because that's where they would shoot. So I had to develop some other way of doing it. And what I did is I got a face and on a piece of cardboard hooked to a pole, and I had it beside me. And as I got near the critical distance, then I would shove that at them, and so they would shoot then after one close. And after we did that, then I would press the absorbent paper against my mask that I had, and it would take up the little individual droplets of venom. And then I could dye that with a dye and count the number that would have hit my eye. And well, it turned out that if you were very close to the snake, it was like a rifle shot. The area hit was small, and it sometimes would miss the eyes completely. Not always, but back at the critical distance, it was more like a shotgun, and so it spread out. And even though the center might be missed, you would still get a lot of droplets in your eyes. And when you got further away, of course, it had spread out further. And as you can see from the picture, that they knew exactly when to shoot. Just the right time that got them there. Well, unfortunately, these snakes finally learned that our approach was not a threat, because we never followed up with doing anything mean to them. In fact, we fed them the next day. And they became tame, and they wouldn't shoot at us anymore. And so, not having enough from a distance, it really, the stats weren't good enough, but it was quite clear to me what was happening, but it hasn't been published and probably never will be, unless I can get some more of these. But they won't let them in Australia. Now, although most of my research over my lifetime has been in herpetology, my early studies were more broadly based. My undergraduate major was in botany, and my undergraduate thesis, which was something like an honors thesis here in Australia, was on bracket fungi, these fungi that form the little plates out of the side of trees, family Polyperaceae. And so I just trying to decide whether I really wanted to go into herpetology after all. And I decided that long before that, but I had this interest, so I was torn between that. But finally I decided that when I was ready to go for my PhD, that I could combine my varied interest by enrolling in the University of Michigan, because at the University of Michigan was Alex Smith, who was the renowned authority on the higher fungi in the world. So I thought, well, I'll go and do my PhD in herpetology, but then I can take classes under Alex. And we went on field trips with him and stuff, and I took a course in lichenology too, which I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And I was accepted for my first PhD by two institutions. One was University of Michigan and one was Harvard. And because of this dual benefit that Harvard had by teaching two different areas of study, I chose that. And I'm pretty sure that I'm one of the very few people who have turned down Harvard. And I've never regretted it. Well, after dedicating years of my life in research to herpetology, I supplemented that by returning to some of my original interests, and I also expanded my horizons in new ways. And this
Yeah, just a bit off.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's now here.
yeah, okay. This picture yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I am yeah, I'll start here. Yeah. Parenthetical, and so I'll tell you back to that. And this picture, previous one, showed something that Oxford University Press published to show my interest in biology. The main chunk is herpetology, but various things grew out of that, as I've described. And there were some things like teaching technology that was separate and so on, but that was to describe that. And then the next one shows my favorite genus, the Laticauda. Parenthetically, I'll add, we're talking about the choosing of fields and actually going into the fields of biology generally. I was born in a conservative Mennonite religious sect, and they weren't really very keen on religion, because they found that as people got educated, they tended to leave the Mennonite church, and and so they developed their own schools and eventually and so on to prevent that. Anyway, I was born into that, and my father was the first person to ever go to high school in our community. And that was a community of 7 separate churches through a part of the state of Virginia. And he did that under parental opposition. They didn't want him to go to high school. Well, things changed after that, and then I started going to high school. But when it came to going to university, myself and my 2 siblings were the first 3 in that community ever to go to the university. Now, our language was an ungrammatical mixture of mountain English, hillbilly English, and 17th century Low German, which was the time my ancestors came over from Germany. And at my birth, no one would ever have predicted that one day I would edit a scientific journal for Oxford University Press, much more, or much less even, that I would take an active hand in the restrictions in the use of language for the regulations for their journal. And I owe that opportunity to my father, who was rebelled against not being able to get at least an education. He wanted to be a medical doctor. And he was a man ahead of his time. And also to one of my school teachers, Grace Wanger, who really started me on a different track. Well, going back out of this parenthesis, while conducting work on sea snakes on various reefs, I became interested in the dynamics of the vegetation on small islands that led me to my second PhD in botany. Now, this was from the University of Queensland, and to a detailed study of the ecology of One Tree Island on Great Barrier Reef in collaboration with Terence Doan and again Elizabeth Cameron. And here you see our lab and our home. It's now an island that is now inhabited. It wasn't at the time other than by us. It also led to a study in conjunction with Meg Lauman, then a postdoc of mine at UNE, in examining the herbivory of insects on eucalypt foliage and its role in dieback in New England, which in turn led to a global survey of the herbivory and introduced stands of introduced eucalyptus worldwide, and finally to participation by me and Sybil Unsicker from Germany in a French project on herpetology, on herbivory in tropical rainforest in Madagascar that involved climbing with ropes by Dumars and so on, living in a tree house in the canopy, and collecting leaf samples from a helium balloon or from a basket suspended from a power jet. Now, the French have really supported a lot of my research, and this was the highest technology I ever found for collecting leaves off trees. And in fact, Miriam Precker and I were also invited to be a part of a French expedition to Antarctica and the islands of the Indian Ocean, where our part was to study the fauna of the soil. On another expedition to Antarctica, our steamship became incapacitated. This was an expedition of no, it's not in there. I'm trying to think of I'm ad-libbing now. The amateur radio people. They go to an island or somewhere nobody lives, and then they broadcast, and all the ham operators in the world try to contact them. Well, they needed some scientists to go along, so we went, several of us, and to make it they could get more money if some scientists were going along. Anyway, the ship became incapacitated on the way back, and we improvised sails from tarpaulins and sailed it for almost 1,000 kilometers on the way back to Australia. And you can view that full-length commercial movie about it now on YouTube. And it's called The Ship That Shouldn't Have. I think I've watched it 30 times since. I think we got into the book of Guinness Records. I've never checked it out to make sure, but I think we did. Well, my involvement in the biology of tropical islands and their interaction with the marine environment eventually led to my becoming the last president of the Great Barrier Reef Committee and the foundation president of its successor, the Australian Coral Reef Society, and consequently into consultancies which led to recommendations of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority for formulation of the regulations for the care and protection of the Great Barrier Reef, and most of these recommendations were taken and are still in effect today for protecting the Great Barrier Reef. And there's a long history about that too, but my biography will include a history of the politics involved in that and the attempts of the corrupt B.L.P. Peterson government of Queensland to obstruct the conservation process. I won't go into more detail of that now. The foray into the dynamics of these communities led me to suspect that to understand city ecology or community ecology in general, it would be necessary to first study the simplest communities available, and that would underpin then investigation of more complex ones. You get some general principles to construct hypotheses for more complex ones. And then that turned out to be the simplest ones I could think of were the terrestrial communities of Antarctica. Now, by terrestrial, I mean that really terrestrial. I'm not talking about penguins and seals that only use the land as a platform for raising young. They get all of their food from the sea and so on. They are not terrestrial. They simply come out to breed there. So these were microorganisms mainly. And tardigrades, how many of you have heard of tardigrades and know about tardigrades? Okay, great. I don't have to explain much about that. They are a very important part of the soil communities in Antarctica. And I got so fascinated by them and their ability to survive in a dormant state that I began to wonder if they couldn't survive outer space. And I went to NASA and I asked them about this. And I said I wanted to go up and do that. And they said, no, you can't go, but we can take your tardigrades out. Well, they said that, but it'll be 3 years' time because we've got all the scientific stuff done now for 3 years. But after that, then come back and we'll include that. Well, in that 3 years, the European Space Program did exactly what I planned, unknowing they didn't know about my plans. So they did it independently. Well, that's another insertion there. Well, you've got the pictures of it. But I did go to look at the soils in Antarctica and the tardigrade soil, as I've indicated. And this shows some of we went by helicopter. This was on the interior of Antarctica, not on the coastal ones. And we went to various ways. We traveled overland on the dog sleds. They had a temporary base in the interior of the continent for 2 years, and we would camp in tents, and they would take us out from one place to another. We'd move, and they would move us by helicopters, and so now where am I? You know, there was a diagram of a tardigrade there, I think, somewhere.
There he is.
During these forays,
So cute.
they're really cute. Yeah, they've been known to survive in that dormant state for up to 60 years. Somebody in Italy did that. And, they live in mosses in the Antarctic, and when it's covered with snow or dried out or whatever, they just go into these dormant stages and stay there. During these forays into other disciplines, however, I didn't neglect the main theme of my research was the sea snakes, but I did become deflected by their geologic history. So to better prepare myself in that field, I earned a PhD in geology and earth sciences with a specialty in paleogeography from the Tropical Environment Studies and Geography at James Cook University. Additionally, these theses, these doctorates, I got another one, which was a DSc awarded by the University of New England in recognition of my lifetime contribution to the sciences. And this is based solely on my research in herpetology. And the DSc is an honorary, it's called a higher doctorate. It's usually not bestowed until 9 years after the PhD or after a lifelong dedication to research. Most commonly it is awarded in British institutions. Very few other countries other than Australia and Canada do that. And it's not the UK. Now, one new element in my research was the study of birds, assisted by Minna Jones. And most of this work was related to changes in the populations of seabirds on the islands of the Swain Reefs. There also was some minor work on birds on the Sahara and the seabirds of Antarctica, and on a Caribbean island, a very small island, Isla Aves, and the latter that was done jointly with Frank Torres from the University of Puerto Rico. That island, Aves, is destined to be completely washed over. Eventually a hurricane is going to hit it, and that will wash it out completely. or it would be submerged. It's only just a small height above sea level at high tide, and so a slight raise in the sea will submerge it. We abandoned massive numbers of boobies in the swains and mapped the nest of individual pairs to see whether they returned to the same nest sites in sequential reproductive seasons, and to follow the decrease in distance between nests of breeding pairs as one of the islands was progressively reducing in size as the island eroded. We found that the birds returned to breed of the same islands repeatedly, but when not breeding, those from different islands intermixed farther north. But they didn't interbreed. But they came back to their own separate islands in the swains to breed. Now, an employee of the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service wanted to compare the genetic constitution of the birds from different islands to see how much genetically different they were from one island to another, since they bred separately from each other. However, he nearly finished his work on this thesis when the Queensland National Parks and Wildlife informed him that he would not be promoted if he didn't quit wasting his time on research. So he gave it up, and he was nearly finished, and he never received a degree or published his data. On my next trip to the islands, I was told that the stakes we had out to mark individual nests were not aesthetically pleasing and had to be removed. Later, however, when the Queensland government was given greater responsibility for the management of these islands, the federal government, someone from National Parks, from the Queensland, called me up on the phone and demanded I send them all of my data on birds, and on the basis that some of their people had helped me doing research there. Well, it turned out they wouldn't let them do it except on their vacations, and they didn't support them financially. So they wanted all the data. Well, I noticed that there's some underage people here, so I won't tell you my complete answer to that phone call. But I did tell them they had Buckley's chance of getting the data unless they did one of two things. Either they could bloody well wait until I got around to publishing it myself, and I'd send them reprints, or they could send somebody over from their office, and particularly one of the guy that started on his thesis. And to my surprise, they did that. So he came over, and we published that information. The main novel development, however, was a return to studying the structure of assemblies of ants, previously only conducted incidental to my faunal survey of the Caribbean Islands I mentioned before. I spent from 2 to 8 months per year in Tunisia for several years as part of a team of scientists under the aegis of the International Desert Bio Program. The highlight was a trans-Saharan expedition by me and 3 colleagues in 1974 in a single Land Rover, partly on tracks, partly off tracks, just navigating across the country. And there's a number of pictures showing, you think of the Sahara as a desert. It's not. It's all combined, but it varies so greatly from one place to another in the different kinds of morphologies of the desert. At the very end, we had just crossed a mountain, and from the top we could see the first sign of humans' residence. The only thing that we'd seen, we saw one Tuareg once. That was interesting because he was way in the distance, just by himself. So we thought, well, we got to go rescue him. We went up to him. All he wanted was a cigarette. They live in the desert. Anyway, that distracted me. Now, where was I? Yeah.
I hope you gave him a cigarette.
Yeah, we got the first sign of. Oh yeah, I must tell you another one too. And after we got across it, we went to some Tuareg villages, and there was one place where there was an Asian woman, and clearly dying, and some disease or other. And well, they assumed that we knew medicine because foreigners need medicine. I happen to have a cough medicine which was prescribed to me in Libya when I was sick. I never knew what was in it, and I have my suspicions. But I know what, it makes you very happy. And I took that along in case we had some serious injuries or something. Well, I gave her a shot of that and she improved. But it was, of course, temporary. And we made sure we put a lot of distance between ourselves and there because we knew it was only temporary, but it did ease her passing, I'm sure. Well, anyway, back to where I was talking about earlier. We got across the Sahara, and we came to the top of a plateau. And we, in the distance, we could see oasis, and there was a petrol station there. And so we were nearly out of petrol, and so we coasted down the mountain, turned the power off, and coasted down the mountain, and then started the motor again once we got to the level, and we drove to this oasis. And as we approached the Bowser, our motor sputtered and stopped. We were out of petrol, and we glided into the Bowser. Now, I would like to report this precise planning was absolutely exact and just what we knew would happen. Well, let's face it, it was blind luck. We didn't go back the same ways. We went back on what's called the Trans-Saharan Highway. It's really a sand track, but it's frequently used, and it was a much safer and quicker route than what we but we wanted to sample different kinds of places and so on. Well, I had a consultancy one year with the government of the United Arab Emirates to help them plan some biological stations. When that was finished, I stayed on to run some transects on the ants. And my wife, the previous wife who died many years ago, was in the U.S. and visiting her relatives, was on her way home, and she stopped in the Arab Emirates to see me where I was working at the time. And the government had then put us, I finished my work with the government, but they said I could stay on and do my transects. Anyway, the government put us up in the local Hilton Hotel, and after breakfast, had an official car waiting to take us out into the desert to run the morning transect. Then bring us back for lunch, and then take us out for midday in the late afternoon transect. They repeated the process for the night transect. And meanwhile, we had these sumptuous meals at the Hotel Hilton. Well, you know, my wife got a bit wondering about this. At the end of this visit, she said, you know, all these years you've been telling me how tough it is to do research in the desert. That's all bull, isn't it? And I don't think that since then that she ever believed that in this era I actually had two times I had heat stroke when I was working in the sun at temperatures of in Fahrenheit 47 degrees centigrade, 40 degrees centigrade. But I really did. Well, I later expanded my studies from the Sahara to global comparison of the structure of ant assemblages along latitudinal and elevational gradients to contrast simple assemblages from extreme habitats such as deserts in the Arctic that contain few species to tropical rainforests with many species. And finally, also to compare equivalent habitats on different continents to assess intercontinental convergences. This project has been in progress for several decades, and with one of the major events being a series of transects from the Olga Mountains in the center of Australia across the deserts westward over almost half of the width of the continent to near coastal Western Australia. We had a map of Aboriginals' water holes. The water was usually green with algae, and the plan was once we had drunk all the clean water from a jerry, we would then fill up green water to use for washing and conserve the cleaner water for drinking. I had a Japanese PhD student, Yoshiko Sakurai at the time, who was accustomed to at least one full tub bath each day. And furtively asked whether she could wash with clean water rather than green water. When I pointed out that if she did, when we ran out of clean water, then she'd have to drink green water. She bravely accepted the restriction. One of our stops was at the Giles Weather Station. In those days, there was no track to it, and the 3 meteorologists manning the station were there for 6-month stints, during which the only person they saw was the bush pilot who periodically flew in with food and other supplies. They saw our desk as we approached it, and at first they thought it was just merely a willy-willy, but later realized it was a proceed vehicle. When we got there, and I got out, and along with 3 girls who were assisting in these transects, all 3 Christmases had come, they thought. How long can you stay? We have beer and a swimming pool. Well, the swimming pool turned out to be a bathtub-sized little ditch filled with bore water, and with a border of grass about 20 centimeters wide around it. But we ran our ant transect and did stay and rest for 1 additional day. So far, I've only published the results from the ant transects of the simplest habitats, leaving the major bulk of papers on ants yet to be published, and that's those things are worldwide. Those transects, and they are yet to be completed. That's one of the last remaining things other than books, but the original research of will be. And no, I'm not going to go for a PhD in etymology. My contact with the University of New England dictated that I retire on the 31st of December following my 65th birthday. Since then, the government's regulations about such things had changed, but my contract hadn't. And as I approached that age, I knew that if I left it too late, I would be too old to get a job anywhere else. So in 1995, I began searching for suitable employment elsewhere. The result was an offer from North Carolina State University in the United States for me to be head of the Department of Zoology at double my salary at UNE, and that was in US dollars, not Australian dollars. So I took that offer and didn't retire until 27 years later. The most attractive part of that offer was that I was allowed to appoint an acting head of the department during the summer when there was very little administration to be done. He was just a caretaker. And during that time, I returned to Australia or elsewhere to conduct research. Well, I'm going to skip the next part. It just, yeah. That was just about my hobbies and other things, but it's not very related to the topic. I did want to mention one part of that, though, however. For most of my married life, my wife and I alternated years in organizing a secret holiday in which one of us planned a trip and the other didn't know what the destination until arrival. We get on a plane, they didn't know that was just one destination to follow by another. This is going to come out either as a chapter in my biography or as a separate whole book, because there are so many funny things, it'll fill a whole book. And Sue planned one this last year, and that was a major feat. And it went to the Lake Eyre and all sorts of places in the deserts in South Australia. Well, in retrospect, I realized that the important part of one's legacy is not the research you have done or the publications you have produced, as very important as that is, because in a few years or decades, that will scarcely be remembered, except in the case of Darwin. Now, he's a real exception to all of this. It'll scarcely be remembered as science advances beyond that and your efforts are no longer applicable or recognized or even relevant maybe. But rather it will depend on what you have invested in fostering the development of your students. Take, for example, the picture of me and Rick Shine, one of my early PhD students, flanked by some of his PhD students and some of his PhD students, and I think even some of the students of the 4th generation. Now, admittedly, something that Rick probably had more students than any of the other of the PhDs I put out. And so this may not be quite as typical otherwise, but if you think of the other 25 PhD students that I've supervised, and the indirect influences of each of these have had on their students, and one becomes conscious of the great burden of responsibility that rests on your shoulders as a mentor of your students. I decided to look back to discover the persons who directly or indirectly have influenced my life, and was able to trace my academic history all the way back to the great French biologist Georges Cuvier. Imagine what he would have thought had he been able to understand how his legacy would extend to the present and beyond. And there is the legacy. Now, I couldn't trace it back any further than Cuvier, because before that, they didn't offer doctorates and so on. And as I said, Darwin is an exception to this, because one, he didn't have any he didn't have a PhD, he didn't have a doctorate or students. And two, his contribution was so great that it won't be superseded, because it was the major heart of biology that everything else rests upon. Well, and also in emphasizing research, one shouldn't underestimate the importance of teaching undergraduate. It is at that level that many students decide on their future careers, and they may be influenced strongly by the teachers they have. Unlike many of my colleagues who consider teaching introductory courses as a necessary drudge to be endured in order to engage in more interesting things, I consider teaching to be a noble profession. Accordingly, I collaborated with Betty Black in the development of better methods of teaching, and we published our results in educational journals. We also produced a series of videos called bio movies, which I don't know if you can still find those anymore or not. I think maybe they've now been superseded. But anyway, they were various biological themes that were made available online to school teachers and college instructors throughout the world, free of charge. Now, the University of North Carolina wanted to charge for the download of those videos, but the U.S. government, which had funded the purchase of our video cameras and the equipment in our laboratory for making the videos and so on, for editing and producing the films, responded and forbade and prohibited any charge to be. I also developed 2 field courses offered in different summers, and in which undergraduate and postgraduate students, high school teachers, and even one faculty member from a different university enrolled for credit. Lectures, discussions, and field observations all were involved. One course was tropical field ecology, and the other was polar field ecology. Over the years, the former involved excursions to the Great Barrier Reef of Australia or to the reefs and rainforests of Caribbean islands. The other consisted of field trips to Antarctica. Despite the fact that students ranked these courses as greatly influential in their choice of a future career, my successor as head of department at NC State canceled those courses because the number of students enrolled was too small. In the USA, the funding of departments was partly determined by the number of courses above a certain minimum number of students. I still feel that those courses performed a very valuable function. In conclusion, a collaboration with students and colleagues in worldwide travel, and I don't regret the decision, as controversial as they seem to some people. There's a picture of the very first lecture I gave, and that was on biology, and that was in 1949. I was a student at Eastern Mennonite High School, and that was the Natural History Club. And I went to, that was my very first lecture. Tonight's lecture is probably my very last one. And I want to thank you for attending that and hear my swan song.
That was terrific, Hal. Thank you. you so much for coming along. I'm sure everyone here very much enjoyed it and are very appreciative of your time tonight. So yeah, it's a remarkable life, 3 PhDs and everything else. It blows your mind. So we're going to get to questions now. While the questions are going along, last chance for raffle tickets. Christian will kind of creep along row by row. If you do want raffle tickets, we've got one paper in the front row. Hal, I will present this to you. I guess you love books, which is kind of a good thing. So that's one that the AHS did a few years ago.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
For more books.
Did you autograph it?
Yes, we did. Yes, I did. Yeah. So we do have some of today's invitations. Have you got another C-State book coming out? Is there, yeah. So there's another. So he's not slowing down. This was the first C-State book that many of you have got. We do have a. So for the book nerds among us. I was very excited. This is one produced by Krieger Publishing, whereas there was the Australian one, so this is the US one. We do, Frank up the back there. Frank's PhD is in pure mathematics, but he said he's no good at adding up, so how to sign it. While we're going with that, questions, we'll throw it up to Hal. Can I start with one? So, first edition, second edition, and then with the third edition, what changes have you seen with your research in sea snake over the past 40 odd years?
Well, as I said, there's only 12, but when Johnson's book came out, there were only 12 people working pretty much full time on sea snakes. And now there's just virgin. And the last one, Harvey White is the senior editor, and I'm junior editor, but I have some chapters there. And one of the things that pleases me most about that book is that my granddaughter, Siobhan Heatwole, is co-authoring a chapter with me.
Fantastic.
But that is not in press yet. We've read edited most of the chapters. There are only about 3 more that come in. And
I think he wants to have those done in March, right?
we're supposed to have it done in March. Yeah. I'm delinquent on 2 of them. I've been too busy otherwise, so I'll take the blame for that.
Yeah. Questions?
You mentioned being bitten just once in your career, but we didn't get the details.
Oh, yeah, it was one of the snakes I marked. It was number 108. And the first time it didn't apparently try to bite.
Oh, wait, but tell the part of the story about what happened when you got, when it actually happened.
Oh, well, I forgot I didn't treat it I never treated the casualty myself. And I hadn't done anything different to that snake than I did to any other snake. Very careful, and I handled it before, no problem. But I guess it got lucky because it bit me. And so I turned it loose. Somebody on one of the crew wanted to kill it. That's what. No. A lucky snake like that you want to kill. And so we put it over the side again. And so they called the Air Sea Rescue. And they sent out a float plane to pick me up, to take me to the hospital on land. And and it was a World War II vintage plane, one of the World War II seaplanes that had been owned by John Wayne, who had sold it to the Air Sea Rescue people. And so I rode in this historic plane. That was worth the life. And when, because it wasn't a fatal one. Anyway, when the plane took off, I looked at it, and my students and so on were out diving for sea snakes already. Yeah. Anyway, I got to the hospital, and a nurse came to prep me and ask me questions. And so some of the questions she asked sounded like land snake bites to me. So I said, well, how many sea snake bites have you treated? She said, oh, you're our first one. And that was not very reassuring. And so I thought, well, I had antivenom. We carried antivenom. Now, it's illegal for anybody to inject antivenom into you unless they are a medical doctor. And not all medical doctors really know enough to do it. And so I didn't want anybody sort of willy-nilly injecting me. There are a whole series of symptoms you go through. And one of them, an fairly early one, is your eyelids begin to droop. Well, when Glenn Burns was bitten by a sea snake on one of our trips, he sat up all night waiting to see if any symptoms would happen. And his eyes began to droop towards the morning, and it worried him they quit drooping. Anyway, going back to so I decided that I wasn't going to report any symptoms until I got the ones I knew then required antivenom. And I got through some early ones, and it nearly got there, but not there. So I wasn't venomated, but not a full dose. And I did that. And the the Australian Geographic wanted me to write an article on sea snakes. So I did, and I had one or two sentences about this. Well, they wanted to expand that to the main part of the chapter, and I balked. I said, no, this chapter is about the biology of sea snakes, not a case history of me. And so they finally acquiesced.
You said that tardigrades can live in the state where they're like sleeping sort of for up to 60 years. How long can they live normally?
How long can sea snakes live normally?
No.
Tardigrades.
Oh, tardigrades. They don't know. The study that they did, what they did when you collect mosses, put in a herbarium, you dry them out, and you put it in an envelope, you seal the envelope, and then you write the date that it was captured, or collected. You don't capture a moss if you collect it. Then if anybody wants to examine that specimen and opens it for some research reasons or whatever, they then reseal it when they finish and write that date. And so a woman at the herbarium in Italy, she went through their whole moss collection and got all the envelopes that had never been opened. And some went back nearly 100 years. And so what she did then is she opened all of those that had never been opened before and put them in warm water and waited to see if any tardigrades came out of these dormant stages. They lose all their water just about. And the strange thing is that they not only lower their metabolic rate, they stop. They're not metabolizing. So any biological or legal definition of life and death, these are dead.
Yeah.
But if you put them in water, warm water, they unfold and come out of that, hydrate, and away they go. And she found that back to 60 years, she could still get them to come out.
The past 60 years?
But, say?
Yeah,
The
but
past 60 years?
past 60 years.
Yeah, but she had some going back to nearly 100, I think, to 100 years. And those, she thought she saw a bit of a twitch or something, but she wasn't sure. And so what probably happens is that when they're in that state, there are particles called cosmic particles that are always bombarding everything. I mean, they're hitting us while we're sitting here. They do everything. And possibly some of those were damaging them while they were in that state. And since they were not metabolizing, they couldn't heal. And so after many, many years, then they do die.
So if they go into anhydride, whatever, if
Anhydride.
they become anhydrobiosis, if they go into that state and then they come out of it and do some life and then they go into that, can they go in and out and in and out and in and out and live forever, theoretically?
Well, unless something else kills them or eats them or whatever.
So nobody really knows
and I had
if
a
they've
pig.
got a lifespan?
Yeah.
So nobody really knows if they've got an actual like lifespan.
No. And I had a student who did his PhD on these, and he jokingly said, well, this is one of the reasons I want to take him out in outer space to see if they could survive that in that state. But he jokingly kept saying, well, maybe all life came from these, and these floated in from some planet somewhere elsewhere, and then they degraded into protozoans, bacteria, but in the end, I think he was almost beginning to believe it himself. He never admitted he always said he was joking, but and I don't think that's true. But
Sorry, what we might do is, I think there's going to be lots of questions, and we're going to be here all night, and then we're going to ask you to sign books, and that's going to be into tomorrow morning. So what we might do is draw the raffle. A lot of people have bought books and want to come up and have a chat and get you to sign them. So we might hold off the rest of the questions until everyone can have a chat and get some books signed. So we'll do, there's two